The polished oak door of the boardroom swung open, and I stepped inside. Every head turned. My stepfather, Mark, stood at the head of the long, imposing table, a smug smile plastered on his face. He was mid-sentence, praising the mysterious new majority shareholder who had just completed a hostile takeover of my father's company. He held a glass of champagne, ready for a toast. He didn't recognize me, not at first. Why would he? The boy he had kicked out onto the street 15 years ago was skinny, scared, and broken. The man standing before him now wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than the car Mark had gifted his own son, Leo, for graduation. My face was harder, my eyes colder. I had learned in the harshest ways that the world doesn't reward softness. Mark's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He squinted slightly. "Can I help you, sir?" "This is a private board meeting." The air in the room grew thick with tension. The other board members, sycophants he had personally installed, looked from him to me, their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. My mother sat to Mark's right, her face a mask of bored entitlement. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly as the recognition finally dawned. She saw the ghost of her first husband, my father, in my features. Then she saw the boy she had abandoned. I walked slowly, deliberately, toward the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the CEO's chair. My footsteps were the only sound in the dead silent room. I placed my leather briefcase on the table with a soft, definitive thud. "You were just talking about me, Mark," I said, my voice calm and even, betraying none of the raging storm inside me. He had no idea the new anonymous majority shareholder he was about to praise was the stepson he'd thrown out with nothing but the clothes on his back. Mark's face went from confused to pale, the colour draining away as if a plug had been pulled. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor and splattering his expensive shoes. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. My moment had arrived. The culmination of 15 years of pain, planning, and relentless effort was about to unfold. You might wonder how a kid they called worthless ended up owning the company his father built. It all started with a deathbed promise and a legacy they tried to steal. To understand the silence in that boardroom, you have to go back 15 years. The memory isn't of oak and glass, but of antiseptic and quiet beeping. My father, Richard, was a giant of a man, not in stature but in spirit. He had built Innovatech from a garage startup into a respected tech firm with nothing but his mind and his relentless will. But in that hospital bed, cancer had whittled him down to a fragile version of himself. Even then, his eyes held the same fire. He would talk to me for hours about his vision, about ethical innovation, about creating products that helped people, not just made a profit. "It's a legacy, Alex," he would whisper, his voice raspy. "It's not just about money, it's about building something that lasts, something good." My mother, Helen, was there, of course. She would sit by the window scrolling through her phone, occasionally sighing with a practiced air of sorrow. But her grief felt thin, brittle. Her main source of comfort was Mark. He was my father's CFO and his supposed best friend. He was a constant presence in those final weeks, always ready with a comforting word for my mother, a hand on her shoulder, a promise to my father that he would take care of everything. He looked at me with what I then mistook for sympathy. "Don't you worry, Alex," he'd say. "Your father is a fighter. And if the worst happens, I'll be here for you and your mother. I'll help you steer the ship." He was so convincing, so smooth. I was 18 and grieving, and I believed him. The last time I spoke to my father, he grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. The beeping of the heart monitor was slowing. He looked past my mother, past Mark, his eyes locking onto mine. "Promise me," he rasped, his voice urgent. "Don't let them ruin it. Don't let them turn it into a cash machine. Protect the company, Alex. It's yours. It's your legacy." I squeezed his hand, tears streaming down my face, and I swore I would. I promise, Dad, I promise. He smiled, a faint, peaceful expression, and then he was gone. Mark put a heavy hand on my shoulder. "He's at peace now, son," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. I didn't know it then, but my father's last breath was the beginning of my nightmare. The promise I made in that sterile room would become the sole purpose of my existence. The funeral was a blur of black suits and crocodile tears. Mark was the star of the show, a pillar of strength, holding my mother's arm, accepting condolences as if he were the widower. He spoke about my father's brilliance, his friendship, his legacy. It was a masterful performance. Looking back, I realize he was auditioning for the role of my father, and in the eyes of my mother and the world, he got the part. The speed with which it all happened was sickening. Before my father's favourite armchair was even cold, Mark was sitting in it. Less than 3 months after the funeral, my mother gathered me in the living room, a strained, almost giddy smile on her face. "Mark and I are getting married," she announced. "He's been such a rock for us. It's what your father would have wanted." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Dad's only been gone 3 months," I stammered. Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold defensiveness. "Don't be difficult, Alex. I'm lonely. Mark provides security." It was a business transaction, and I was an inconvenient line item. When I tried to protest further, to appeal to my father's memory, she cut me off. "Your father is gone. We have to move on." And move on they did. Mark and his son, Leo, moved in the following weekend. Leo was my age, with a perpetually smug look and an air of entitlement that grated on my soul. My room, the one I'd had my whole life, with a view of the oak tree my dad and I planted, was given to Leo because it was larger. I was moved into the small guest room at the back of the house. My father's study, his sanctuary, was cleared out and converted into Mark's home office. Photos of my dad were quietly replaced with bland art prints. The golden child scapegoat dynamic was established immediately. For his 18th birthday, Leo was given a brand new BMW. I was told I needed to get a part-time job to pay for my own car insurance. When I brought up the college fund my father had set up for me, Mark explained that the funds had been reallocated to cover new household expenses. Meanwhile, at Innovatech, Mark used my mother's grief and her shares to orchestrate his appointment as the new CEO. His first act was to announce a new corporate strategy focused on aggressive growth and cost-cutting, a direct betrayal of my father's core principles. I was a prisoner in my own home, watching a vulture pick apart my father's corpse while his son wore my life like a stolen coat. The promise I made to my father echoed in my head, a constant mocking reminder of my powerlessness. Life in that house became a masterclass in psychological erosion. Every dinner was a trial. Mark would hold court, talking about his grand plans for Innovatech, while Leo would chime in with some sycophantic comment. My contributions were met with silence or a condescending smirk. Mark's favourite tactic was the comparison. "Your father was a risk-taker, a visionary," he'd say, looking at me with theatrical pity. "It's a shame none of that rubbed off on you, Alex." My mother would just nod, adding, "Leo has been such a help to Mark at the office. He has a real mind for business." They were building a narrative, brick by painful brick. Leo was the heir, and I was the defective relic of a bygone era. My grief was reframed as laziness. My quiet nature was a lack of ambition. Determined to honour my promise, I forced myself to approach Mark about a position at the company. My father and I had always planned for me to spend my summers learning the business from the ground up. I proposed this to Mark, framing it as my desire to learn and contribute. He put on a show of magnanimous approval. "Of course, Alex, I think it's a wonderful idea. It's time you took some responsibility." His smile was a warning I failed to heed. My internship was a calculated humiliation. I wasn't placed in engineering or marketing. I was sent to the sub-basement archives, tasked with digitizing 2 decades of paper invoices. The room was windowless, damp, and smelled of decaying paper. Meanwhile, Leo was given the title of Special Projects Coordinator, which meant he had a desk right outside Mark's office. He'd walk by the archives on his way to a business lunch, peering in with a smirk as I sat covered in dust. I tried to make the best of it, working diligently, even creating a more efficient system for the digitization process. I wrote up a proposal showing how my system could be implemented company-wide to save time and money. I nervously presented it to Mark. He glanced at the first page for less than 5 seconds before tossing it onto his desk. "Alex, your job is to scan documents, not to reinvent the wheel," he said, his voice laced with patronizing amusement. "Let's leave the big picture thinking to the people who understand it." He then turned to Leo and winked. "Some of us are builders, and some of us are just janitors." In that moment, I wasn't just his stepson, I was his scapegoat, and he was making sure the whole world knew it. The summer of humiliation ended, and I retreated further into myself. I was working a menial job at a local diner, saving every dollar, trying to piece together a future that felt impossibly distant. I knew I couldn't stay in that house, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. Mark and my mother seemed content to let me exist in the margins of their new, perfect life, a constant, silent reminder of their generosity. But my presence was a loose end, and Mark was not a man who tolerated loose ends. He needed to cut the thread completely. The end came swiftly, and it was more brutal than I could have imagined. Leo had been given a prototype of a new tablet Innovatech was developing. He paraded it around the house, a symbol of his status as the chosen son. Then, one evening, he claimed it was missing. A frantic, theatrical search ensued, led by Mark. Of course, they found it in my room, tucked under my mattress. It had been planted, obviously, but the staging was perfect. I came home from my shift, smelling of grease and exhaustion, to find the 3 of them waiting for me in the living room. The tablet was on the coffee table like a piece of evidence at a trial. Mark's face was a mask of grave disappointment. "I am so disappointed in you, Alex," he began, his voice heavy with fake sorrow. "I took you in. I treated you like my own son. We gave you everything, and you repay us by stealing. Did you think you could sell it? Is that what this is about?" I denied it, of course. I looked from Mark's smug face to Leo's triumphant smirk. My last hope was my mother. I turned to her, my voice cracking. "Mum, you know I wouldn't do this. Leo is lying. This is a setup." She just stared at me, her expression as hard and cold as marble. There was no flicker of doubt, no maternal instinct, only icy condemnation. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "To think you would steal from the company your father built. He would be so ashamed of you." That was the final blow. The love I'd clung to, the hope that some part of the mother I knew was still in there, vanished. Mark pointed to the door. "Pack one bag. I want you out of this house in 10 minutes. You are done here." 10 minutes later, I stood on the sidewalk, the front door clicking shut behind me. I had a duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, $200 from my diner job, and a promise to my dead father that now felt like a curse. I was 18 years old, and I was utterly alone. The first few years were a blur of desperation. I slept on friends' couches until I wore out my welcome, then in a beat-up 1998 sedan that cost me every penny I had. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. I was a dishwasher, a night shift stocker at a grocery store, a security guard staring at empty monitors. I ate instant noodles and day-old bread. Every moment was a struggle for survival, but in the quiet, lonely hours, the burning shame and cold rage kept me going. The image of my mother's dead eyes and Mark's triumphant smile was seared into my brain. My promise to my father wasn't a curse, it was a compass. It was the only thing that gave the suffering a purpose. I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing. Every spare dollar went into a savings account. Every spare hour went into studying. I enrolled in night classes at a community college, devouring books on finance, economics, and corporate law. I was fueled by caffeine and a singular obsessive goal to understand the language of my enemy. I transferred to a state university, graduating with top honors in business administration. I was disciplined. I was focused. I was a ghost, invisible to the world that had cast me out, slowly forging myself into a weapon. During my studies, I kept coming across a name in old business journals when researching Innovatech's founding, Arthur Vance. He was my father's original partner, the engineering mind who had helped design their first groundbreaking products. He had been pushed out into a forced retirement shortly after Mark took over as CFO, years before my father's death. It took me a month to find him. He was living in a modest house 3 states away, tending to his garden. He was wary at first. He saw a young man and likely assumed I was a salesman, but when I said my father's name, Richard's son, his eyes sharpened. I told him everything: the promise, the betrayal, the exile, my relentless years of study. I even showed him the dusty proposal for the archival system I had written during my sham internship. He read it carefully, a faint smile touching his lips. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw someone look at me and see my father. "Your dad always said you had the fire," Arthur said, his voice raspy with emotion. "Mark is a parasite. He's been bleeding that company dry for years. I've been watching." He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a forgotten fire of his own. "Revenge is a dish best served cold, kid, but to serve it, you first have to own the restaurant. Your real education starts now." Arthur's house became my university and my war room. For the next 10 years, he taught me everything. He didn't just teach me business, he taught me how to think like my enemy. We dissected every quarterly report, every press release, every public filing Innovatech released. Arthur had the institutional knowledge. He knew where the skeletons were buried. I had the raw hunger and the modern financial training. Together, we painted a grim picture of Mark's reign. He was a corporate parasite, just as Arthur had said. He was systematically dismantling my father's legacy for short-term gain. He slashed the research and development budget, the very soul of the company, to inflate profit margins. He sold off valuable, long-term patents for quick cash injections to fund lavish executive bonuses and shareholder dividends that primarily benefited his and my mother's stock holdings. Mark's arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. He saw himself as a titan of industry, a financial genius who had made an old, stuffy tech company lean and profitable. He surrounded himself with yes-men who praised his every move. The company's stock price stagnated, weighed down by his lack of vision, but the cash flow he was generating made him look successful on paper. He was eating the seed corn and calling it a harvest, and he was too proud to see the coming famine. This was our opening. His mismanagement was making the company he was looting cheaper to buy. Our strategy was one of stealth and patience. As Arthur said, "A loud attack is easily repelled. We will be ghosts." With Arthur's remaining capital and every dollar I had earned and saved, we started buying. We couldn't use our own names, so we created a complex web of shell corporations. We founded LLCs with bland, forgettable names: North Star Ventures, Ironwood Capital, Cascade Holdings. From the outside, they were just unrelated small investment firms. Each one purchased small blocks of Innovatech stock, never enough at one time to trigger reporting requirements or raise alarms. We moved like sharks, silent and deep beneath the surface. We recruited a few other key investors, 3 grizzled engineers my father had hired, all of whom had been forced out by Mark. They joined our cause not just with their money, but with a righteous fury that matched my own. For years, we patiently, relentlessly acquired shares. Mark, meanwhile, was busy buying a new yacht and putting Leo on the cover of a local business magazine as the future of Innovatech. He had no idea he was celebrating on a sinking ship, and we were the ones drilling the holes. The years bled into one another. My life was a monotonous cycle of work, analysis, and execution. Arthur and I were monks devoted to a single, sacred text, the stock market ticker for Innovatech. We watched our ownership stake creep up with painstaking slowness. 5%, 10%. We celebrated 25% with a quiet handshake. At 35%, we started to feel the pull of gravity. Every percentage point became harder and more expensive to acquire. There were moments we held our breath. A financial columnist once wrote a small piece on the curiously persistent and fragmented buying of Innovatech shares, suggesting a stealth takeover might be in progress. Mark, in a fit of pique, issued a press release calling the speculation the stuff of fantasy, reassuring everyone that the company was stronger than ever under his leadership. His arrogance was our shield. The real breakthrough came from Mark himself. Bloated with success and desperate to make a splash, he announced Innovatech was acquiring a flashy but failing virtual reality company for an exorbitant price. It was a vanity project, a pathetic attempt to paint himself as a tech visionary like my father. The market saw it for what it was, a colossal waste of capital. The day the deal was finalized, Innovatech stock tumbled by nearly 30%. Investors panicked. Mark was on business television defending the move, but his words were hollow. For him, it was a PR crisis. For us, it was the opportunity we had spent a decade waiting for. Arthur and I, along with our small consortium, liquidated every other asset we had. We poured every last dollar into buying the discounted shares. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Arthur finished the final calculation. He looked up from his computer, his face pale, and simply nodded. We had 51.7%. We had control. There was no shouting, no triumphant celebration, just a profound, heavy silence in the room, filled with the ghosts of 15 years of sacrifice. A quiet, grim satisfaction settled over me. It was done. The next morning, a crisp legal letter was messengered to Innovatech's corporate headquarters. It was written on the letterhead of Apex Holdings, the largest of our shell corporations. It formally notified the board of a change in majority ownership and invoked our legal right to call an immediate and mandatory meeting to discuss the new leadership and strategic direction of the company. Mark would be expecting to meet a faceless private equity shark. He would have prepared a speech, a slideshow, a bottle of champagne. He was getting ready to bow to his new master, never once suspecting that his master was the boy he had thrown into the street. The countdown had begun. On the day of the meeting, I drove myself to the Innovatech headquarters. The sleek minimalist building my father had commissioned had been renovated. The warm wood and stone lobby was now a sterile expanse of chrome and black marble, dominated by a massive, gaudy portrait of Mark, smiling like a king. The receptionist asked for my name. I simply said, "I'm here for the board meeting." She checked her list, frowned, and was about to turn me away when Mark's personal assistant came out to greet the mysterious new owner. She saw my suit, my calm demeanor, and assumed I was the man. She led me down the hall, past my father's old office, its door now bearing a plaque that read, "Mark Peterson, CEO." Every step was a ghost of a memory, but I felt no nostalgia, no sadness. Just the cold, quiet hum of an engine that had been running for 15 years, finally reaching its destination. She opened the boardroom door, and I stepped into the scene I had replayed in my mind a million times. Mark was at the head of the table, champagne flute in hand, his voice booming with false bonhomie. So while the ownership may be new, we are confident they will recognize the incredible value and leadership we bring. A toast to a new and profitable chapter. My mother sat beside him, looking bored. Leo, now a slick-haired VP of Business Development, sat opposite her, basking in his father's glow. He smirked as he saw me enter, likely assuming I was a messenger or a coffee boy. Then recognition flickered across their faces like a failing light bulb. I ignored their stunned expressions and walked the length of the table, my footsteps echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. I stopped at the empty CEO's chair, placed my briefcase on the table, and looked directly at Mark. The champagne glass dropped from his hand and shattered. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "You were talking about me," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "But you seem to have me at a disadvantage." I looked around at the stunned faces of the board members he had hand-picked. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Alex Sterling, and as the sole director of Apex Holdings and its subsidiary funds, I control 51.7% of this company." Mark's face, which had gone white, was now turning a blotchy red. "No," he stammered, shaking his head. "No, that's impossible. You're nobody." He looked at me with pure hatred, seeing not a man in a suit, but the greasy kid from the diner. "This is a trick." I pulled the chair out, the legs scraping softly against the floor, and sat down at the head of my father's table. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. "Impossible was standing on a sidewalk with nothing but a duffel bag, Mark. This," I said, gesturing to the room, "is just the consequences of your actions finally catching up to you. Now, please, sit down. We have an agenda to get through, and the first item is your immediate termination." Mark's face cycled through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Rage, panic, disbelief. He tried to rally his allies. "This is absurd. Board members, you can't possibly allow this." I cut him off, my voice as sharp and cold as ice. "They have no say in it. But for the sake of transparency, let's review your tenure." I nodded to Arthur, who I had asked to join the meeting and who had been standing silently by the door. He stepped forward and placed a thin folder in front of each board member. I stood up and began to pace slowly. "Let's start with the acquisition of Virtue Life, a company with no revenue and no viable product, which you purchased for $80 million, wiping out 30% of our stock value in a single day. A vanity project." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The facts were my weapons. "Then there's the R&D budget. My father built this company on innovation. You have cut R&D spending by 70% to fund dividends and stock buybacks that enriched you personally while strangling this company's future. You turned a creator into a cannibal. It's been eating itself alive to make you fat." I stopped behind Leo's chair. He was trembling, refusing to look at me. "And of course there's the outright theft." Arthur clicked a button on a remote, and the large screen behind me lit up with copies of bank statements and invoices. A $500,000 payment to a marketing consultant in the Cayman Islands, which coincidentally was the exact amount of the down payment on your new yacht. The luxury cars leased for executive use that your son drives. The family vacations to Europe billed as international business development. The room was silent, save for the rustling of papers as the board members stared at the proof of Mark's corruption. My gaze swept over them, then landed back on Mark. "I hereby move for the immediate termination of Mark Peterson as CEO and chairman of the board for gross negligence and corporate malfeasance. I also move to terminate the employment of Leo Peterson, whose redundant position is a flagrant example of nepotism." I turned my head slightly, my eyes meeting my mother's for the first time. They were filled with terror. "And I move for the immediate removal of Helen Peterson from the board of directors due to her complicity and clear conflict of interest." I didn't need a vote, but I held one anyway. One by one, The sycophants raised their hands in my favour, saving their own skins. It was unanimous. I looked at Mark, his world utterly destroyed. Security will escort you out. Please gather your personal effects from your office. You have 10 minutes. You are no longer welcome in this building. After security escorted them from the room, a profound silence descended upon the boardroom. The remaining members stared at me, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. They were waiting for a tirade, a victory speech. I gave them neither. I sat down in my chair, opened my briefcase, and pulled out a new set of folders. "Now then," I said, my voice level and professional. "The next item on the agenda is the Stabilization and Recovery Plan for Innovatech. I'm appointing Arthur Vance as Interim Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. His first task will be a full audit of all departments." I was no longer the vengeful son, I was the CEO. The past was settled, the future was business. The collapse of their world was swift and total. The life Mark and my mother had built was a house of cards, financed by my father's company. Within a week, the company cars, Mark's Mercedes and Leo's BMW, were repossessed. The corporate credit cards were cancelled. The mansion they lived in was owned by a subsidiary of Innovatech. An eviction notice was served. News of the takeover and Mark's spectacular fall from grace spread like wildfire through the city's elite. Their fair-weather friends vanished overnight. They were social pariahs, stripped of their wealth, status, and dignity in one fell swoop. They had nothing, just as I had once had nothing. About a month later, my assistant informed me that a woman was in the lobby demanding to see me. It was my mother. She looked 10 years older. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple, worn-out dress. Her hair was unkempt, her face etched with desperation. She rushed towards me when I came out. "Alex, please," she sobbed, grabbing my arm. "We have nothing. He's left me. I have nowhere to go. I made a mistake. I was manipulated. But I'm still your mother." I looked at her, and I felt nothing. The gaping wound she had left in me had long since scarred over, and the scar tissue was hard and unfeeling. I gently removed her hand from my arm. "No, you are not," I said, my voice quiet but firm. A mother wouldn't have stood by and watched her son be systematically destroyed. A mother wouldn't have looked him in the eye and told him his dead father would be ashamed of him. And a mother certainly wouldn't have thrown him out onto the street. I saw a flicker of the cold woman from that night appear in her eyes before being replaced by tears of self-pity. "You made your choice 15 years ago, Helen," I continued, using her first name for the first time. "You chose a man and his money over your own son. You are not a victim of his choices. You are a consequence of your own." I turned and walked back toward the elevators, leaving her standing alone in the lobby of the company my father had built. That was the last time I ever saw her. With the rot cut out, Innovatech began to breathe again. My first act as CEO was to call an all-hands meeting. I stood before the employees, not as a conqueror, but as a steward. I laid out my vision, which was, in truth, my father's vision. I announced we were tripling the R&D budget, effective immediately. I told them our goal was no longer to squeeze every last cent from old ideas, but to create the future, just as we had in the beginning. Over the next few months, I worked with Arthur to track down the brilliant engineers and designers Mark had cast aside. We brought them back, one by one. We brought back the soul of the company. People who had been beaten down by years of Mark's cynical management began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. The energy in the building shifted from fear to excitement. The fire for revenge that had burned in me for 15 years had cooled, leaving behind not emptiness, but clarity. I had thought that destroying Mark was the goal, but I was wrong. Watching him and my mother fade into disgraced obscurity brought no joy, only a quiet finality. The true victory wasn't in their downfall, but in my own ascent. It was in the hum of the servers in the R&D lab, in the excited chatter of engineers sketching on whiteboards, in the return of the hope and optimism my father had instilled in this place. The real vindication was not in tearing down, but in building up. I had honored my promise, and in doing so, I had finally healed myself. I was no longer the boy on the sidewalk. I was my father's son. One evening, months later, I was working late in my office. I had redecorated it, removing the cold chrome and marble Mark had installed, replacing it with the warm oak and leather my father had loved. Where Mark's gaudy portrait had once hung, there was now a simple, dignified photograph of my dad, taken in the early days, his eyes bright with passion and vision. I stood and looked at it, the city lights twinkling through the large window behind me. The long, brutal war was over. The ghosts were finally at peace. I felt the heavy weight of the promise I'd carried for so long finally lift from my shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I had come home.